Welcome to video number 2 for Chapter 12, The Second War for Independence and the Upsurge of Nationalism. The War of 1812 had been a small war, with only 6,000 Americans killed or wounded. Globally unimportant as a war, the war had huge consequences for the United States. Other nations developed a new respect for America, and in the diplomatic sense, the conflict could actually be called the Second War for American Independence. Sectionalism had been dealt a black eye. The Federalists were the most conspicuous casualty. War heroes emerged, Andrew Jackson and William Henry Harrison, who would both later be elected president. Abandoned by the British, Indians were forced to make terms as best they could, and in an economic sense, the war bred greater U.S. independence with increased manufacturing. Canadian patriotism was increased by the war as well, but many felt betrayed by the Treaty of Ghent. They were aggrieved by the failure to secure the Indian buffer state or even mastery of the Great Lakes. The Rush-Bagot Agreement, which was signed in 1817 between Britain and the United States, was for limited naval armament on the Great Lakes. The border fortifications were later removed between the United States and Canada, and to this day, the United States and Canada share the world's longest unfortified boundary, 5,527 miles long. Nascent nationalism was increasing during this time period, and this was the most impressive byproduct of the war, was heightened nationalism, the development of a national consciousness or national oneness. America may not have fought the war as one nation, but it emerged as one nation. And writers such as Washington Irving and James Fenimore Cooper attained international fame as American writers. The revised Bank of the United States was approved by Congress in 1816, and the new national capital began to rise in Washington. The Army was expanded to 10,000, and the Navy further covered itself with victory in 1815 when it beat piratical plunderers of North Africa. The American system grew out of this time period, and nationalism was manifesting itself in American manufacturing. Patriotic Americans took pride in factories. Following the war, the British tried to crush U.S. factories, these emerging factories, by flooding the American market with cheap British goods. So Congress tries to protect American manufacturing by passing the Tariff of 1816. It's the first tariff passed primarily for protection, not to raise money for the government. The rates were 20 to 25% of the value of dutiable imports, and there was a very high protective trend started here with the tariffs. Nationalism was highlighted by Henry Clay's plan for developing a profitable home market. He developed what he called the American system, and it was proposed to create a strong banking system to provide easy credit, provide a protective tariff to protect Eastern manufacturing, and to build a network of roads and canals, especially through Ohio, that would meet the great need for better transportation. Spending for this plan conflicted with Democratic-Republican constitutional scruples. Congress voted in 1817 to distribute $1.5 million to the states for internal improvements. President Madison, though, vetoed this measure as unconstitutional. Individual states had to fund their own construction, including of such things like the Erie Canal, which was completed in 1825. Jeffersonian Republicans rejected direct federal support for intrastate internal improvements and felt that each state should pay for its own internal improvements. And New England strongly opposed it because it would further drain away population from New England and create competing states in the West. This was the beginning of the so-called era of good feelings. James Monroe was nominated for the presidency in 1816, and this was the last time that a Federalist would run. Monroe was an experienced, level-headed executive, and emerging nationalism was cemented by Monroe's Goodwill Tour in 1817. Boston newspapers announced an era of good feelings was upon the American country. In the era of good feelings, there was considerable tranquility and prosperity in the early Monroe years, but it was also a very troubled time. There was extensive debate over the tariff, the bank, internal improvements, and the sale of public lands. Sectionalism was growing in the United States, and the debate over slavery was growing as well. In 1819, an economic panic or depression descended on the American public. Deflation, bankruptcies, bank failures, unemployment, and overcrowded debtors' prisons were all problems of the time period. Factors contributing to this catastrophe were the over-speculation of frontier land, and the West was hit hard when the Bank of the United States forced the Western banks to foreclose on many farm mortgages. In the Panic of 1819, the poorer classes were hit hard. This also sows the seeds of Jacksonian democracy and calls attention to the inhumanity of imprisoning people who were debtors. Agitation against imprisonment for debt results in remedial legislation in many states during this time period. At this time, the West was also expanding as well. 9 states had joined the original 13 between 1791 and 1819. To keep the balance between the North and South, these states were admitted alternately, one free state and then one slave state. This was a continuation of the generation-old movement west. People wanted to move west because land was cheap, newcomers were coming from other countries and were eager to move west to get their own land, and tobacco was exhausting the land in the South. Other causes of the growing West were the acute economic distress during the embargo years. Native Americans in the Northwest and the South had been crushed by the generals Harrison and Andrew Jackson, and new highways improved land routes to the Ohio River Valley, such as the Cumberland Road, which was built in 1811. In 1811, the first steamboat was also built, and on West, this basically made upstream navigation accessible on the western waters and made transportation a lot faster. The West was still weak in population and influence, allied with other sections to gain influence. The Land Act of 1820 helped with access to land. People could buy 80 acres at a minimum of $1.25 an acre in cash. But the West demanded that the government fund transportation and slowly received it. The West was also frustrated by the Bank of the United States and resistance to easy credit. This is a picture showing pioneers moving westward from Baltimore. And this type of scene was very typical as people began to take new opportunities and move west. And we'll continue to look at rising nationalism and the increasing westward movement in our classroom discussions.